So we're carrying on our study in this wonderful story, an amazing story of God's love and care. Events, real events in the life of a family, Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. A story that follows on well from our previous studies in Deuteronomy, because it emphasizes some of the themes we looked at there, even though it's set in a little later period, in the times of the judges, we're told. A time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But here's a story of faithful people and God being gracious to them. Perhaps as we continue this story of redemption, we can reflect back on our own life and see how God's hand has been in the events of our lives, being gracious to us, redeeming us as we came to know Jesus. In the same way that at the end of this particular day that we read of in chapter 2, Naomi and Ruth could look back at the events of that day and could see God's hand of grace in the events of that day. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I've always been a big reader of stories and novels. Actually, I have so many things to read at the moment. I'm reading fewer novels, which is sad. But I remember reading things like Famous Five and Secret Seven. And putting myself in the story, imagine myself in the shed of the Secret Seven as they met together at the bottom of the garden, making their plans and hatching their stories. Uncle Quentin and the big house he used to have, I think, in the Famous Five, and imagining myself in that house. Things like Swallows and Amazons, don't know whether you ever read that series either, and imagining myself in the Lake District, in a boat, travelling around the islands and the adventures that they used to get in. And then later on in life reading things like Lord of the Rings and imagine myself on the side of the forces of good fighting the battles of the forces of evil, trying to climb my way up the mountain of Mordor to put the ring in the middle of the lava, putting myself and immersing myself in the story. And then as I began to read the Bible a little bit more, as I came to know Jesus, to immerse myself in the stories that I read there, imagining myself on a hillside as Jesus is teaching and engrossed in what he's saying, sharing bread and fishes with people around me and amazed at what's happening. Sitting in a room as Mary pours out perfume and the smell in the room as the aroma of the perfume drifts around the room. And what I want to encourage you today is, as we read this story as Ruth, and as in the series we look at this story as Ruth, is to immerse yourself in the story and imagine yourself maybe as Ruth, maybe as Naomi, maybe as just someone who's alongside them, imagining their life. Because we've already looked at the real struggle that Naomi particular has had. This mother-in-law, Naomi, and daughter-in-law, Ruth. A real struggle, some might even describe it a living hell. The previous chapter, we hear that Naomi's husband, Elimelech, it's a good word, isn't it? And decides to leave the promised land, a land that God had chosen for his people and was a land of blessing. In famine, he decides that actually God isn't providing for them anymore, and I'm going to go down to the Moab land and find food there. A land of foreigners, a land outside of God's blessing and God's promise. And Naomi goes with him, and the two sons go with him. But while they're in the land of Moab, the two sons marry, and they marry foreign wives. They don't marry people from the tribe and the people of the Hebrews, those who would worship God. They marry foreigners. And then her husband and her two sons die, and she's left with her two daughter-in-laws, who she encourages to go back to their own families and to leave me. I'll go back home. You just stay here with your own family. They'll provide for you. But Ruth decides to go home with Naomi. It's not Ruth's home, it's Naomi's home. But Ruth decides to stick with her. Stick with her because she says in verse 16 of chapter 1 that this God of Israel, I want to be my God, and this people of Israel, I want to be my people. And so I'll go back home with you, my mother-in-law. Why does Ruth do this? Why does she go back home? Well, I wonder. What has been the witness of her mother-in-law, Naomi, to her that has reached her to, for herself, find her faith in this God of Israel, Yahweh, the one who her mother-in-law worshipped? Well, perhaps it was the dress that her mother had. Maybe her mother dressed as a Hebrew. She didn't adopt the dress of the Moabites, more refined. Maybe she kept things simple. I don't think it could have been just that. Maybe it was the long silences as Naomi prayed in her home that Ruth noticed and asked questions of her husband, Naomi's son. I'm not used to this. I've joined this family which worships a different God. What is she doing? Maybe Naomi sat in a corner with a shawl over her head and prayed. And maybe Ruth noticed that. Maybe it was Naomi's disposition and the way that she behaved and the way that she treated people. The love that she showed for her family, the love that she showed for people around her. Maybe it was that. Maybe it was the respect she showed for the faith of the people around her, because she was in Moab with the people worshipping a different God. But maybe also it was the fact that she clung fast to and held on to her own faith, not just respecting other people's, but clinging to her own faith in the God that was her God, the God who promised always to be with her and to be her God. Maybe it was the tenacity of her own faith. Maybe it was what she shared with Ruth of that faith. Maybe they had conversations about who this God was, of his acts of unfailing love and grace to his people. Whatever was going on between the relationship of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, it had led to Ruth saying, I want this God to be my God. I want to worship him. I want to be part of his people. Makes us think, doesn't it, about our own witness and what people see in our own lives. Maybe things that we don't notice that other people do. Maybe they notice the way that we treat other people differently, that we show love and compassion and grace to others. Maybe they notice how we stick tenaciously to our faith and to the God who loves us. Maybe it's simple choices that we make that people notice. Maybe it's when we talk to them about the faith that we have and how much Jesus mentions and means to us. It means we need to be careful with the choices we make, don't we? And the conversations that we have. It means we need to make a point of having those conversations and sharing what God has done for us in our own lives and what he means to us. Dare I say that maybe you should invite people along for a coffee in your home to do that, or go for a coffee with them, or even bring them along to the alternative gathering on the first Sunday of the month at the beach deck and do that. It's another opportunity for people to understand what our Christian faith is all about and what it means to us. There you go, publicity over. But that's where we arrive at this story, that Ruth has chosen to accompany her mother-in-law back to Bethlehem. I don't know about you, but I'm rubbish at detective stories. I watch things like Foyle's War on the TV. I don't know whether that's a favourite of yours. And I'm constantly thinking, so who's done it then? And I never get it right. Maybe you're better at it than I am. But I'm grateful that at the beginning of chapter 2, we don't have a whodunit here. We're introduced to the hero of the story. Well, is Boaz the hero? Verse 1 says, Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. Right, okay, we're going to learn later on as we get introduced to Boaz. But we know that he is the guy who's key in the story. So it isn't a whodunit. I don't need to worry about that. That's great. But we're told something that Ruth isn't aware of. She doesn't know this. The writer is telling her this. As far as Ruth is concerned, today is just another day. She's just going about her relationship with Naomi, her care for Naomi, because she's there to support her mother-in-law. Just another day as far as Ruth is concerned. She doesn't know who Boaz is and how he's going to be involved in her life. A happenstance, maybe an accident. Or is it God ordained? Has God brought this events of this day about? Well, we'll find that out. But how will Boaz react? We're introduced to him. How's he going to react to Ruth, this Moabitess, this foreign lady, this alien outside the people of Israel? Probably of a different skin colour, probably of a different dress maybe, but someone who's notably different and a foreigner. How's he going to deal with her? Is it going to be kindness or cruelty? Is it going to be generosity or is it going to be meanness? Is he going to be a racial bigot and just exclude her because she's not part of the people of Israel? Is he going to be a bit skittish in the presence of a beautiful young lady? A Moabitess, someone different? Well, we're told two things about Boaz. We're told that he's a relative on her husband's side, a kinsman of Ruth and Naomi. And he's also a man of standing. A man of standing. So let's have a look at those. A kinsman to start off with. Well, we need to remember that families back then and in the culture weren't the same way as families are today in British Western society. You know, it's not the nuclear family we're talking about here when it talks about him being a kinsman, a family member. We're talking about families bigger than that, of tribes, almost of nations. To Israel, the family was the prime focus of God's relationship with them. Think about Noah and his sons and his wives that are saved in the flood, and a covenant that God makes with Noah and his family. Think about the Passover night when they're rescued from Egypt. The lamb that was, and the blood that was posted on the lintels of the doorways was to save the whole family, made secure in the place marked with the blood. But let's not take that too far. Let's not say, okay, well, that's about God saving and working with families, therefore God saves families. We're not making the claim that Christ's blood is shed for families. He sacrificed his blood and himself for individuals. We all have personal responsibility and accountability to how do we respond to God's gift to us of Jesus. Christ's blood is shed for us. It is poured out for us. But it's poured out for us as individuals. We can't rely on the faith of others, other people in our family, to save us. But what we can say is that the family was the basic unit of society and structure. Not so in the same way in modern day Britain. Israel's understanding of itself as God's people was built socially, theologically, economically, all bound together around the idea of family as the focal point. Family solidarity was extremely strong, with obligations to protect one another in the family. So as Christians, we can say that we need to support family solidarity. We need to support the family unit. But if we just do that, we still might miss the mark. It's okay to say we want to support families and we want to support the family unit, but we need to think about relationships, about economics, and about society. C.H. Wright has said this: in Israel, family meant families would enjoy a degree of economic independence based on equal shares in the nation's wealth, in which a family could feel it has some social relevance and significance in the community, in which every family has the opportunity to hear the message of God's redemption in a culturally relevant and meaningful way. Let me repeat that last bit. It's where a family can feel it has some significance in the community and has the opportunity to hear the message of God's redemption in a relevant and meaningful way. So we don't just want to support the family, we want to make sure that families and individuals get the chance to hear God's message, to hear God's grace, to understand what that means to them. So as Christians, we want to try and give them that message in a way that they can understand. Some families might feel that they've lost their voice in society. We might even treat them as if they've lost that voice and exclude them from some things. I was just thinking about the fact that election turnout, what's the percentage now of people voting? 30% or so of people feel like it's worth doing. They feel like they've got enough of a voice to go and cast a ballot box vote. Maybe that says something about people who feel like they haven't got a voice anywhere anymore. So maybe as Christians we need to pray for, we need to encourage, we need to get alongside people who feel like no one's listening to them, that no one loves them, that no one cares for them. Let's pray for Christians who are living their lives trying to give people and individuals a voice, trying to get alongside people and act as an advocate for people in society, trying to bring families together, trying to build up family life, but also introduce the gospel to them and share what God's love means to them. Let's pray for them. Maybe God's calling us to get involved in something like that. But here's another challenging thought around families, if families are so important in this story. 40 or so years ago, maybe not as long as that, families would have the husband as the breadwinner, wouldn't they? Perhaps working 5 days a week and 2 days off. I remember my dad worked in the bank Monday to Friday, Saturday and Sunday were days off. So Saturday was sort of family day. Sunday was church day. Not just once, not just twice, 3 times a day. Maybe you can remember those times. We did things church-wise on Saturdays as well, things like missionary events I used to remember going to and things. But generally speaking, Saturday was family day, Sunday was church day. Or if both parents worked, they might still have Saturday and Sunday off. There wasn't lots of different shift patterns and shift rotations and days where people were working one day and their other partner isn't working. Now, frequently, both parents are working irregular hours, often working 6 days a week. And if they only work 5 days a week, it's often not the same 5 days. So, if family time is squeezed, and it limits time available for church activity, how do we respond as church? Does it mean we need to provide different services or events on different days? Does it mean more of a focus on small group activity and less on focusing on regular large events? Maybe it means more of a focus on one-to-one discipleship or prayer triplets meeting together. Do we simply accept that our large regular events, people aren't going to turn up week after week after week? Maybe people only turn up because of what's happening in the rest of their life once every 3 weeks. Or do we just say, yeah, but in my day we still managed to get the kids along to church 3 times on a Sunday. And we did it that way, so why can't they? There's a question for you. I'm not giving you the answer. But someone said to me the other day, we have different chapters in our lives, and your chapter of training for ministry in the Baptist church is another chapter in your life, that you've been involved in other things, in other chapters in your life. And I wonder, how do we support people as church, as individuals, through those different chapters of their lives? A family with 3 young kids, how do we support them so that they don't drift away from church? They don't drift away, therefore, from their faith, and then they never come back again. How do we support people through irregular attendance? Because we don't want them to drift away. We don't want them to disconnect from God's people. So Boaz was a kinsman. Families are important. How can we support one another? Support our families. Support those around us. But he was also a man of standing. There we go. A man of standing. It's the same word he is used as Gideon, a mighty man of valor. It's translated valor when it's talking about Gideon. It's the same Hebrew word in Judges 6:12. Sometimes it means riches, a man of riches and wealth. It's in Isaiah 61. Sometimes it means moral worth. Someone who's a good guy, does the right thing. Boaz later on, in chapter 3, verse 11, if you want to look at it, talks about Ruth as someone of noble character. It's the same word used here of Boaz, a man of standing. Ruth, a lady of noble character. Seems that Boaz is a man of integrity, a man of influence, a man of means. They don't always go together. Integrity, influence, means. They should of us as Christians. Ruth noticed Naomi and noticed things in her life that led her to faith. How we are should lead people to the cross, to Jesus, shouldn't it? How we treat them, how we use the power at our control, how we use what God has given us. We brought our offering this morning. How do we use the money that we've kept back? How do we use that to bring glory to God? It's a challenge to us. But what it doesn't say here is what is Boaz's sort of heritage, blood heritage. Matthew 1 verse 5, when it goes through the genealogy of Jesus, he tells us that Boaz's mother was Rahab. Boaz's mother was Rahab, a foreigner. Not just a foreigner, but a foreign prostitute. The woman who helped the spies in Jericho and later escapes the destruction of the city. And she marries into the people of Israel. Perhaps this is one reason why Boaz treats Ruth the way he treats her. Because he knows what it is to be treated as a foreigner, maybe to be excluded. It talks about him here as a man of standing. I wonder in his younger age and younger years whether people saw him as a man of standing or whether people saw him as the son of a foreign prostitute. His background, his experience led him to treat Ruth in the way that he treats her. Led him to empathise with her situation. And I wonder whether our background, our experience enables us to do the same thing or gives us the opportunity to do that with people around us. The things that we've been through, maybe the hurts, the pains, the grief that we've dealt with, maybe our background and where we come from. How does that give you the opportunity to show grace and mercy and God's love to people around you? So that's verse 1. I hope you brought your sandwiches with you this morning. Anyway, yes, we'll go quicker through the other verses. Verses 2 and 3 says this. Ruth the Moabite says to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." Naomi says, "Go on then." So she goes out, enters a field and begins to glean behind the harvesters, pick up the leftovers, as it were, at the edges of the field. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So without going into too much detail, basically the law said that for God to look after the foreigner, the homeless, the widow, that people who owned land and grew crops in the land, rather than harvesting right to the edges of the fields, they leave a bit around the edge of the field so that those who don't have very much can actually survive. God does that because he's a generous God, because in his law he wants to defend the cause of the fatherless and the widow and the foreigner among you, it says in Deuteronomy 10. Why? Because you were once foreigners, he says to his people. Because you were once foreigners, you were foreigners living in Egypt. Because you were foreigners, because I love all people, I want you to remember where you've come from. And I want you to treat people the way that I've treated you. I've cared for you. I've rescued you. I've redeemed you back in Egypt. I got you free. So treat people in the right way. Because I am like this, I want you to treat people like this. And God's whole law is reflected in how he looks for and cares for people. If you look at 1 Peter 2, verses 9 to 12, in the New Testament, as Christians, Peter says exactly the same thing to you and to me. Says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. You are God's special possession. Why? That you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you're the people of God. Once you hadn't received mercy, but now, Peter would say, because of Jesus, you have received mercy. Then he goes on to say, dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. You were foreigners, you're now a people. You were far off, you're now brought home. You weren't a people of God, now you are. You're my children, says Peter. Live lives that reflect who you are and who I've called you to be. Think of the harvest fields as the life that you live, of the time that you have, as the way that you live your life. Think about them, the harvest fields, as how you use your life and how you use your time, what you say to those around you, the choices that you make, the way you treat people, the resources that you have to possess. In the law, it said to the landowners, don't harvest up to the edge of the fields. Leave a bit around the edge of the fields for people. If we think of our lives as the harvest fields, I think God wants to say the same thing to us. Leave space in your life for people around you. Leave time, leave your resources. Use some of your money to point people to me, to share the love that I've shown you with people around you. We were looking at that as we looked at Deuteronomy, if you were here at that point. You see, it was required of the landowners to look after the poor and the foreigner and the widow. Unscrupulous landowners wouldn't do that. They'd make it difficult. They'd harvest to the edge of the fields. If people came to do some gleaning, they wouldn't let them. It relied on the favour, the choice, the decision of the landowner. I think Boaz sees the landowner as God, not himself. I think the way he treats Ruth comes, yes, out of his experience, but out of his relationship that he has with God and how God's been gracious to him. God is his all. And I think that's why he treats Ruth the way it is. In verse 3, we have that interesting phrase, as it turned out. As it turned out that Ruth entered the field of Boaz. Sounds like it's an accident, doesn't it? But the actual Hebrew in there has a her before chance. It's a suffix before the Hebrew word for chance. It's saying she happened upon, Ruth happened upon. It was her chance. This wasn't meant to be an accident. The way it's phrased in the Hebrew is almost meant to get us to read it as if it's saying, accident? Of course not. This isn't just an accident, an incident, a happenstance. It just so happened that Ruth went to Boaz's field. The way it's constructed, it's reading that this is Ruth's chance that God has given her. We don't have chances in our life. You may be able to point back to times in your life where you've seen it as an incident, an accident, a chance, but actually God has been using that in your life. I was sharing at the Women's Fellowship a bit of my journey and Jan's journey to where we are right now. Our chance meeting, I met Jan at church in Liverpool when I went to be a student. It was the church that my brother had been to, and my brother said, well, that's a good church, why don't you go along to that one? And that's where I met Jan. My first student digs as a student just happened to be in the same road that Jan was brought up in Liverpool. She didn't live there anymore, but 10 doors down from where she was brought up in was where my first student digs were. My mum and Jan's mum were evacuated to the same place, Anglesey, in North Wales, if you know it. My dad was living at the same time, about 5 miles down the road, and they never met each other at the time, but they did later on in life. I met my previous boss when I started working for Claybury because I went up to Spurgeon's College to talk to the principal about how I might be involved in Christian ministry. And he said, you need to go and speak to Colin. He's downstairs speaking on something that you've just told me was your specialist subject when you did your master's degree in psychology. And he's down there speaking on it. You need to go and have a word with him. Chance meetings? I don't think so. I don't want to paint a picture that God uses as chess pieces on a chessboard. Because if we look at this story, Ruth has made a request to Naomi to say, can I go and do some gleaning? Naomi's granted her the permission to go and do it. Ruth chooses the field that she goes to, but it's Boaz's choice of how he deals with Ruth. So it's not just some sort of chess piece game that God's playing with our lives, but God is involved in our lives, and he wants to be more involved in our lives. It's a relationship of grace. And it's through that relationship that God speaks to us. He speaks to people around us, and he uses us. I'm going to jump through a few bits and pieces. But as we get to later on in the passage, verses 12 and 13 particularly, as you look through that, we have a prayer of Boaz. A prayer of Boaz for Ruth as he meets her. And he says, I want to look after you. Don't go anywhere else. I'll look after you. I'll provide for you. It's not just that you're going to gather the bits around the field, but you can actually go behind the harvesters and do some harvesting behind that, so you can get more than you would normally. I'll give you some water to drink during the day. Here's some food to eat. And he says to his workmen and his foreman, as it were, look after this girl, protect her. And actually, when she's not looking, drop a few bits on the ground so she gets even more than she could have. What a sign of God's grace to us. Not just what we've got entitled to or we have a right to, but he gives us so much more. He pours like a flood, we were singing, his grace down on us. But here's Boaz's prayer for Ruth. And it's interesting, isn't it? He says, may the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. May you be rewarded. It's not Ruth asking for a reward. It's Boaz saying, may God look after you. May he enrich your relationship with God. May he be your proper reward. Genesis 15 verse 1, when God's speaking to Abraham, he says, don't be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward. I am your shield, your very great reward. That's what Boaz is praying for Ruth, that God would be a shield and that he would protect her. And it would look after her. And he prays for wings of refuge for Ruth. Again, Deuteronomy 32, verses 10 and 11, says this. In a desert land he found him, speaking of the people of Israel. In a barren and howling waste, he shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his life. Aye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. Boaz is praying an amazing prayer for Ruth, for safety, for refreshment, for stillness in the storm that she's under. Remember, here's a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. They're at the last ebb, as it were. They've probably got not much food left, if any. And they need sustenance. They need life. They need bread. They need food. Boaz prays not just for that, but he prays for safety, for stillness, for help, for relaxation, for hope for Ruth. And how much she needs it. How much she must have been crying out for it as she went. Boaz's prayer is that she'll experience a real trust in this God that she's come to worship. A real relationship of trust with him. What a picture of God's grace and mercy to us. Not just that God gives us what we're due because Christ has paid the price for us, but he wants to lavish so much more upon us. He wants to pour down his grace upon us. And at the end of the day, it's say Ruth takes home this, is it ephah, however, 5 litres of grain. She was expecting to take a little bag home, and she takes home what is the equivalent of a huge jar that someone could get inside. That's what she takes home because God has so blessed her in this day. So much so that when she does get home and shares the story with Naomi, Naomi suddenly goes, "What on earth has happened today? I was expecting to go home with a little bag of grain and you've come home with this huge pile of stuff." Talks about God's loving kindness to us and his grace towards us. Someone's written this: Naomi's whole attitude of mind has been to see the hand of God in the circumstances of her life. Earlier, she'd held on to his grace through the sufferings and the grief of bereavement. Now she experiences the grace of God's provision through the generosity of this wealthy farmer Boaz. We too can learn to see in all our circumstances, be that suffering, be that bereavement, be that God pouring down grace upon us and abundance upon us, the hand of a gracious God. But it's through God's people that God shows his grace and his mercy. It's through Boaz that Ruth and Naomi understand and see God's grace. Paul, when he's talking about grace in Corinthians, he talks about grace as an offering, physically, a financial offering. He talks about the collecting money that the churches have been giving to support other people, and he says that is a sign and a symbol of God's grace. It's through your generosity that God's been able to act. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you've been a part of giving that. But it's only through us that God demonstrates his grace. It's the behaviour, the actions, the choices that we make. Leaves me with a couple of questions. First question is this as we leave this morning. How can I, in the situation of where I am right now, in the week ahead, in the week that I've been through, how can I, in the situation that I live in the circumstances of my life, live in a way that reflects God's character and his covenant of grace? How can I do that so that other people experience God's grace around me? And more than that, how can I see in my situation God is acting in a gracious way with me and those around me? How can I see that? Ruth didn't see that during the day. It's only when she came home and shared it with Naomi, and Naomi said, "That's amazing." Maybe we need to do that a little bit more. Maybe we need other people to help us see how God is being gracious to us and blessing us. Let's pray as we close.